There is a people who were supposed to have vanished 3,000 years ago. Their empire fell. Their capital burned. Their armies scattered into history, and the textbooks moved on. And yet, in villages scattered across northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and the diaspora churches of Chicago, Sydney, and Stockholm, families still say the same surnames their ancestors carried when Nineveh stood. They still call themselves Assyrian. For a long time, that claim was treated as sentiment. A beautiful story a persecuted minority told itself to survive exile, genocide, and forced assimilation. Historians were polite about it. Linguists were curious about it. But genetics, the kind of evidence that does not care about pride or politics, was never supposed to settle the question. Then researchers started sequencing the genomes. And what they found did not simply confirm an old identity. It complicated the entire timeline of the Middle East. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story was straightforward. The Assyrian Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient Near East, collapsed around 609 BCE under the combined pressure of Babylonian and Median armies. Nineveh fell. The imperial structure that had once stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean disintegrated. After that, the standard historical narrative treated Assyrian as a closed chapter, a name that survived only in ruins, in cuneiform tablets, and in the Hebrew Bible, where the Assyrians appear as conquerors and antagonists. Modern people who called themselves Assyrian, in this framework, were assumed to be doing something symbolic. Perhaps their ancestors adopted the name later, out of religious identity, regional pride, or nostalgia tied to Syriac Christianity. It was assumed that the population itself had been absorbed, diluted, and replaced many times over, by Persians, by Arabs, by Kurds, by the endless waves of empire that moved through Mesopotamia for 2,500 years. The name might have lingered. The bloodline most assumed could not have. It was a clean story. It fit the pattern historians expected from a region that had been conquered, reconquered, and repopulate more times than almost anywhere else on Earth. But there was a problem historians could not fully explain, and it had nothing to do with genetics at first. Religious and linguistic continuity in this population was unusually stubborn. Communities identifying as Assyrian continued speaking dialects of Aramaic, the same language family spoken in ancient Mesopotamia and, according to tradition, spoken by Jesus himself, long after Arabic became the dominant language of the surrounding region. Their church liturgies preserved forms of worship that predated Islam by centuries. Their surnames, many of them, carried Akkadian and Aramaic roots that had survived, largely unbroken, in an unbroken chain of oral transmission. That kind of cultural persistence is rare. Populations that are fully absorbed tend to lose their language within a few generations. This one hadn't. Something about this community resisted the normal pattern of assimilation seen almost everywhere else in the post-imperial Middle East. It was not proof of anything, but it was a signal that did not fit comfortably into the name without bloodline theory. Then genetics entered the story, and the question stopped being about language and liturgy. It became a question written into the genome itself. Researchers working with modern Assyrian populations began comparing their DNA against neighboring groups, Iraqi Arabs, Kurds, Iranians, Turks, and Levantine populations. The tools used were the same ones geneticists use to trace any population's deep history, autosomal DNA, which reflects ancestry from all lineages combined, alongside uniparental markers, mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through the maternal line, and Y chromosome DNA, passed only from father to son. Together, these markers act like layered sediment. Autosomal data shows the broad blend of a population's ancestry. The maternal and paternal lines can reveal whether that blend happened recently through open intermixing or was locked in place generations, even millennia earlier. What the data showed was not simple continuity. It also wasn't simple erasure. Modern Assyrian populations carried a distinct genetic signature, one that set them apart, statistically, from the Arab, Kurdish, and Iranian populations who now surround them geographically. That distinction was not small. In population genetics, when a group has been living for centuries inside a much larger regional population without fully merging into it, geneticists call that relative genetic isolation. And relative isolation, sustained across a long period of time, tends to preserve older ancestral signals that closely intermixed populations lose. That was the first crack in the name-only theory. But the deeper the studies went, the more the story shifted from confirmation into complication. The genetic data did not point to a single, pure, unbroken line running straight back to the Assyrian Empire with no outside contact. No population on Earth carries that kind of story. The idea of a perfectly sealed bloodline is, itself, a myth that genetics tends to dismantle wherever it is tested. What the data showed instead was something more layered. Modern Assyrian genomes carried strong affinities to ancient Near Eastern populations, genetic strata associated with the Fertile Crescent going back thousands of years, while also carrying smaller, more recent admixture signals from surrounding groups, consistent with limited intermarriage over centuries rather than large-scale absorption. In other words, the wall between Assyrian and everyone else was never airtight. But it was real, and it had held, imperfectly but persistently, for an extraordinarily long time. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. If stories like this fascinate you, the ones where science quietly rewrites what we thought we knew about a people's past, this is a good moment to subscribe, because there is far more hidden in the human genome than most of us were ever taught. At this point, researchers were left with several possible explanations, and none of them could be ruled out immediately. The first explanation was straightforward regional continuity, that a core population in the Mesopotamian heartland, the region encompassing ancient Assyria, never fully dispersed after the empire's political collapse. Empires fall. Populations mostly do not. The people who farmed the plains around Nineveh, Ashur, and Arbela did not disappear when the imperial administration did. Many simply kept living where they had always lived, under new rulers, speaking evolving dialects of their old language, and eventually organizing their identity around a newly dominant religion, Christianity, adopted early and fiercely in this region, centuries before Islam arrived. The second explanation involved religious sorting rather than pure bloodline. Under later Islamic rule, religious minority status, rather than ethnic identity, often determined who intermarried with whom. Christian communities in the region, including those identifying as Assyrian, Chaldean, and Syriac, frequently married within their own religious networks for centuries, not necessarily because of ethnic ideology, but because of the social and legal structures of the societies they lived in. That kind of religiously bounded marriage pattern can produce exactly the kind of relative genetic isolation researchers were seeing, even without anyone consciously trying to preserve an ancient bloodline. The third explanation was more unsettling for the clean narrative, that the modern Assyrian identity itself may be a composite, a name and cultural framework that absorbed multiple older Mesopotamian and Levantine Christian populations over centuries, some with deeper roots in the Old Empire than others, blending into a shared ethnic and religious identity only in the last 1,000 to 1,500 years. None of these explanations canceled the others out. That was the uncomfortable, fascinating part. The evidence did not resolve into a single tidy answer. It widened the question instead of closing it. Then came the study that changed the weight of the conversation. Larger-scale genomic comparisons, incorporating broader reference panels of ancient DNA from Bronze Age and Iron Age Near Eastern remains, allowed researchers to do something earlier studies couldn't: compare living Assyrian populations directly against ancient skeletal genomes recovered from Mesopotamian and neighboring sites, rather than only comparing them to other living populations. This is where ancient DNA, genetic material extracted directly from bones and teeth thousands of years old, becomes decisive. It removes centuries of guesswork. Instead of asking, who do modern people resemble, researchers could finally ask, how closely do modern people match the actual ancient inhabitants of this land? The results were not a perfect, unbroken bloodline match. No population's genome behaves that cleanly. But they showed meaningful continuity between modern Assyrian populations and ancient genomes recovered from the broader Mesopotamian and northern Fertile Crescent region, continuity that was measurably stronger than what researchers found when comparing those same ancient genomes to several other modern regional populations. That was the twist researchers had not fully expected going in. Not because ancient roots were surprising. Every population has ancient roots. The surprise was the degree of preservation, that a population which had endured empire after empire, conquest after conquest, forced conversion campaigns, massacres, and mass displacement, especially during the catastrophic violence of the early 20th century, still carried a genetic signal old enough to reach back toward the world of cuneiform tablets and ziggurats. The genome had not simply recorded survival. It had preserved something closer to a memory, one written in molecules instead of stories. This is where the science stops being only about one population and starts becoming something larger. Because what the Assyrian genetic story reveals is not a myth of purity. It is something more interesting than purity, evidence that identity, language, religion, and ancestry can travel together, reinforcing one another, holding a population together not through isolation from history but through persistence within it. The old assumption that thousands of years of conquest automatically erase a people's genetic past turns out to be too simple. Populations are not passive. They are not simply overwritten by whoever rules them. Sometimes, under the right social and religious conditions, a population can absorb political domination for millennia while still preserving something ancestral beneath the surface. That is not a story unique to Mesopotamia. It is a pattern researchers are now finding in other long-persecuted, religiously bounded populations around the world, from isolated highland communities to island populations to certain diaspora groups whose religious practices functioned, unintentionally, as genetic boundaries. Picture the landscape itself for a moment. The dry plains north of Mosul, where wheat fields run toward the horizon and the Tigris cuts a slow, ancient line through land that has been farmed for over 7,000 years. Somewhere beneath those fields lie the foundations of Nineveh, walls that once held the largest city on earth, now buried under sediment, war debris, and modern towns. Villagers still walk that land carrying surnames: Eucana, Malek, Shabo, Odisho, Warda, Aprim, Benjamin, and others, names that trace not to modern administrative record-keeping, but to a linguistic lineage stretching back toward the Akkadian and Aramaic naming conventions of the ancient world. Names spoken over kitchen tables in Chicago and Sydney today, carrying, unknowingly, fragments of the empire's oldest vocabulary. It is easy to think of ancient civilizations as closed chapters. Something finished, sealed, available only through museums and reconstructed inscriptions. But genetics keeps forcing a correction on that assumption. Civilizations end as political structures. They do not always end as people. What the DNA evidence ultimately suggests, carefully, without overstating certainty, is that the Assyrian identity claimed by modern communities is neither a pure, unbroken royal bloodline nor an empty label borrowed from history. It sits somewhere more complicated and more human, a population shaped by real, measurable ancestral continuity with the ancient Near East, layered with centuries of regional admixture, held together not by isolation but by faith, language, and social structure acting, generation after generation, like an accidental archive. The empire fell in 609 BC, but something the empire produced, a people, a language family, a set of names, and a genetic signature reaching back toward the cradle of the earliest cities, did not fall with it. If there's one thing studies like this keep proving, it's that history is rarely as finished as we assume. Let me know in the comments which population's DNA story you want uncovered next. The map we were taught was too simple. Empires end. Borders shift. Languages evolve. But somewhere underneath all of that motion, certain threads hold. Not because history was kind to them. Almost never because history was kind to them. But because a population, quietly and stubbornly, kept choosing to remain itself. The genome does not lie about that kind of persistence. It simply waits, patiently, for someone to finally ask the right question.